Hi everyone, welcome again. In the last video, we developed the simplest possible API. We learned how to use REST controller and get mapping annotations. In this video, we are going to see a new annotation request mapping. Before we do that, don't forget to subscribe the channel so you don't miss the future updates. Let's get started. In the last video, we added this health controller and it had a single method health status, which is annotated as get mapping with a mapped URL health. And then we used this particular URL to access this endpoint. Right now the API is running, and if we go back to the client, which is the browser in this case, and if we type this URL and hit enter, we see status up, which is being returned by this method. Now let's extend the same example and consider we have to add more endpoints, more methods in the same controller related to the health endpoint. So for example, we want to return thread dump. This is returning a simple string. This could be anything related to thread dump, but the important thing is we are trying to extend the existing endpoint. So the new endpoint that we want to expose for thread dump is something like this, which starts with health and ends with dump. And similarly, we want to add a new endpoint to return the memory usage. And the endpoint that we are thinking, the URL that we are thinking, is something like this, starting with health and ending with memory. We have added the methods. The remaining thing is how to bind these methods so that we can service the requests. We know that we need to use get mapping because all these are HTTP GET requests, and we need to add the @get mapping annotation with the matching pattern. So we can start by adding the get mapping annotation, something like this, and then we know we have to provide the matching URL pattern. And in this case, because this endpoint is specific to thread dump, so we know we have to give the value this, which is health/dump, so that when the user hits this URL from the browser or from any client, Spring Boot can find this method with the matching pattern and it can trigger the execution of this method. And similarly, we know in order to return the memory usage and in order to bind this method, we need to use get mapping annotation again. And this time we need to provide the URL pattern like this. And if we restart this service, the service is up and running now, and we can try accessing these URLs to test the service code. So we'll go to the browser and first we'll try the dump endpoint. This is returning all threads, means it's working fine. And similarly we can try the second endpoint related to memory. So we'll go to the browser, use this URL, and we see memory usage, which is being returned by this method. So we know we successfully added the methods and we successfully linked the URL patterns to these methods. This is all working fine, but as you can see, we are repeating health URL pattern in all these methods, which is not a good practice. So how do we solve it? We need to understand that an API code base can have multiple controllers, and all these controllers would handle different functionalities which exist in the API. Ideally, we want to have a single controller for a certain functionality, and all the related methods to that functionality should go under that controller. So what that means is, if you take this example, we know health is a certain part of functionality which is being exposed by our API. That means all the health related methods should go under the health controller, which is the case here. So we have defined all these methods under the health controller. But the problem is we are not able to define a consistent URL pattern related to the health functionality. We are repeating it for all the methods. There is a better way to use the request mapping annotation. If we go to the documentation, it says that this annotation can be used to map web request onto methods, but it can also be used on the class. Here it is. This annotation can be used both at class and the method level. We use request mapping annotation to bind the web request onto a method or onto a class. So that's what we are going to use. We can use request mapping annotation to define a URL pattern, a binding pattern on the class level or on the controller level. So we know this health controller is specific to the health functionality, and in that case we can define a consistent health URL pattern which will be common for all the methods in this health controller. And if we do this, we don't need to provide this health URL pattern for the health status. It will be treated as the default URL after health. This is the case. And for the dump endpoint, we can remove the health from here. We just need to provide the dump, which is specific to this functionality. And for the memory, we can again remove the health, and we can simply pass the memory, which is specific to this functionality. And if we do this, you can see we have removed the duplication. What we are doing, we are defining the URL pattern for health functionality on the controller level. So all the URLs that start with health will be intercepted by this controller. Spring Boot will see there is a controller which is responsible for health endpoint, and it will redirect all the requests related to health to this controller. And after that, it will start matching the methods. So in this case, if we are hitting the health endpoint, it checks that, okay, this health will be intercepted by this controller, but after health, there is nothing, and it's a get call. So it will be handled by health status method, this one, and it will return up, which is the hard-coded string. But if we try this particular URL, which is health/dump, Spring Boot will again try to match the URL. It will check the first part is health, so it will call health controller, and after that it will see this part, which will be mapped to this particular method, because the overall URL pattern will start from here /health and then /dump, and so this method will be called. So let's restart the service and give it a try again. The service is up. Let's try to hit the health URL like this, and we see it is returning up, which is the correct value. For the dump, we see the correct value, all threads, and similarly if we call memory, we see memory usage. We saw how to use request mapping and when to use request mapping. We also learned how Spring Boot matches the URL pattern in order to execute the right method. So that's it for this video. Stay tuned and thanks for watching.